into a little bit about Tempranillo and Roberto Duero here as we get into these wines. If you know anything about Spanish wine, you know Tempranillo is the main grape. It's grown all over the country. It has many different names and many different styles, whether it's from Rioja, from La Mancha, from all over the country. In Roberto Duero, in the center of the country, it's a big dry high plain, and it drops down into the river valley. So what you have is a very short, condensed growing season with lots of extremes. Very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter, but shorter, more intense season. So it's different than, say, Rioja, that has a lot of the Atlantic and Mediterranean influences affecting the wines. And also the way the wines are grown in Ribera, it's 7 times the size of Napa Valley, but it's very similar to Napa Valley in that it's not constrained by the aging rules that we think about when we talk about Rioja or the other regions. When you learn about Spanish wine, you learn about the Grand Reservas, the Reservas, and all those things. In Spain, in Ribera, it's more about the quality of the vines, the location within the region, and who you have making the wines. So you can come onto the scene and make really spectacular wines, as evidenced by Peter Pingus came along in the 90s and made arguably the most expensive wine in Spain there, not too far from where these vines are grown. So when we get into Tempranillo from Ribera, because it's a continental climate, inland, you have old vines, high elevation, really, like I mentioned before, really small, dense clusters, but lots of thick skins and concentration in the skins. The Tempranillo from this region tends to be a little richer, a little more powerful, a little bolder than you'd see in other regions. And so you'll find this in the Pinea 17 and then onto the flagship wine. We'll get into this. And at first you smell, actually, the thing I like about these wines when I show them to people is it's a familiar smell. You get lots of nice, ripe, lush fruit. You get some oak influence, the vanilla and the baking spices. These are things that people that know the wines that are growing right behind me are familiar with when they taste the wines. The wine sees, what's the percentage on the 70%, I think, French oak, and then the rest is American oak. And it's about 18 months in there. So it's a medium aging, but the fruit is there to stand up to it. This comes from the 40 to 70-year-old vines on the property. So that sounds old, but in Pinea terms, those are the young vines. And so we'll get into this. Yeah, a lot of plum and red fruit. It's got a lot of the spices that you expect with Tempranillo, baking spices, almost curry spices, coriander, cumin, things like that. Vanilla from the oak and cinnamon and spice. But it's really well balanced. Neither thing dominates, and that's the important thing with wines is you really don't want the oak to overshadow the fruit in the wine. You want it to be sort of like the frame on a painting. It makes the painting look better, but it doesn't dominate it. So in this case, they're really nicely integrated and balanced. So if the nose is familiar, then the palate is kind of where this gets people's attention and says, hey, this is not Napa Cabernet. This is not something I'm completely familiar with. Because of the elevation and the temperature change in the region, you get great acidity, great balance to the wines. So you can get a lot of extract and a lot of concentration, but yet it tastes balanced because you have really nice freshness on the finish. And that's what I get with this wine. You expect it to be a big, burly, tannic wine, but then it just kind of lifts off on the finish. So you get that nice little squirt of acidity on the finish that makes it refreshing and juicy, makes you want to go back for another one. That's also what makes it really friendly with food and things like that. So at first it seems familiar, but then on the palate you realize it's something different and something interesting, and you want to go back to it, drink more of it.
Absolutely. Delicious as well. That's a good segue into asking Scott or Hugo, whoever wants to answer, that you can have extreme weather where your vineyards are and it's at higher altitude. How does that help make your fruit unique?
Well, Scott, let me give it a shot, and then I'll turn it over to you. I think Tempranillo is one of those fruits that loves stress, and by stress I mean temperature fluctuation between daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures. In order to achieve these colors that you see on the glass, the fruit needs to be exposed to the sun, and that's where it kind of thickens the skin and becomes darker in skin. But if you don't have the coolness of that the altitude gives you, it can be very acidic. And so we're very fortunate that our vineyards are where they are, because the altitude really gives the wine that there are a lot of elements that go into it, of course, but just speaking of elevation, altitude, and exposure, it gives the wine a beautiful color, but at the same time a beautiful texture and not overpowering acidity, because the fruit recovers at night, and then towards the end of the growth season, it matures very slowly. Obviously, it gets colder towards September and October. The days get shorter and the nights get a little cooler fairly quickly in this part of Spain. And so with that cooler temperature, the maturation process of the fruit is slowed, and that allows our winemakers to harvest at the perfect time, generally late in the season, and still keep all the important characteristics that will eventually show in the wine. I'm sorry. So I don't know, Scott. That's my take on it. What do you think?
Yeah. For me, one of the things that was really exciting about visiting the property was seeing, we went up above the vineyard to a little plateau, a couple hundred feet above the vineyard, and you look out across and all you see are mesa tops as far as you can see. So we're about 1,000 meters up in the vineyards there, and everything from the entire appellation is down from where we are. So we're the very top of the appellation, which means you get the maximum diurnal shift between the daytime and the nighttime. And that's the reason why this neighborhood is where a lot of the top wineries in the region, Pingus, Sastre, some of the other, Rhoda has their property there. And it makes it a really choice area for some of the best Tempranillo. Tempranillo grows all over Spain. And so some of it's great and some of it's not. But there aren't as many places that really make the best Tempranillo. One of the things about Tempranillo, it means early. So it's early ripening generally. That can be good or bad. It's good if you're trying to beat the rains in, but it tends to crop very heavily and produce a lot of fruit. So sometimes you have too much fruit on the vine. It's overproductive. The wine is dilute and not quite as interesting or as concentrated or as complex. In areas like this where you get a lot of stress, like Hugo said, on the vines, and the age of the vines that the Pinea wines have, that creates more concentration, more stress, which gives you more density and complexity in the resulting wines that are made from those fruits. So it's important to remember that there's a lot of Tempranillo in Spain, but there are only a few places where you really get the best combination of pushing the ripeness all throughout the season, so you get the really highest quality fruit to make the wines from. And it works really well. But the thing about Tempranillo that is interesting is that acidity that you have and the lack of really overpowering strong tannins gives it a very wide range of applications. So I was at a bar in Spain, and I just kind of looked up at the wall and saw a wine that was really interesting wine, and we were eating octopus, and we drank this Tempranillo-based wine that at second thought, I thought, well, there's no way this is going to work. This is a big red wine. And it worked because the acidity was bright and the tannins were soft. And so even a combination like that you didn't think would be a textbook pairing worked out beautifully. So you do have a very wide range. And you see in Spain, they'll do paella, which is a mixture of meat, rice, spices, seafood, all that stuff, and drink it with a red wine, usually based in Tempranillo, and it works beautifully. So very wide range of things, but lamb and jamon and ham, pork, those are the kind of the classic regional pairings. It's great with steak too, obviously.
Scott, you have a member asking as well, Peter, who's asking, he says, to me, this compares to a really good Pinot as opposed to a Cab. What would you compare this to with a French or California wine?
Yeah, to me, as a Pinot, it's more like a California Pinot because there is a significant amount of oak. You wouldn't think of it as like a Burgundy or an old world Pinot so much. But it does have, Tempranillo is sort of in that gray area between Cabernet and Pinot. It has a little bit of the best of both. It has the acidity of Pinot Noir, but then the boldness and the richness of Cabernet. So it's a good observation to see that it is somewhere in between, because It's not trying to be one or the other. Its identity is in that medium bodied, versatile, good acidity, but maybe a little more concentration than a Pinot. If I was going to compare it to a Pinot, I'd say something like a rich Russian River, something like a William Salem or Costa Brown, something like that. It would fall in with those wines.